Hey, good evening. With a worship set like that, we can't help but be blessed by God tonight. I've been at Hope for about a year now. I'm one of the pastors on staff. In particular, I get to work with an incredible group of single adults here at Hope. And they threatened they were going to do that. In Raleigh, the single adult population is one of the fastest growing groups, and a bunch of them are now here at this campus, and I'm so glad to see them here tonight as well. Listen, I'm glad to see you here tonight, but I just want to tell you, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm not really sure why that I'm up here tonight. I'll tell you why. This is supposed to be a Young Gun series, and you weren't supposed to laugh that loud. But Pastor Mike called us into his office, some of the guys on staff, a couple of months ago, and he told us about this summer series he wanted us to do, some of the young guys on staff. I started doing a quick accounting of everyone who was in the room, and I noticed there were 26 and 28 and 32 and 32 and me. I'll say that again. They were 26 years of age, 28, 32, 32, and me. And the problem is, I'm not in either one of those decades. I'm not. And so I started taking notes, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, I was to be the note taker of the meeting. But as God would have it work out, some act of God or some oversight of Pastor Mike, I'm actually part of the Young Guns series. Now, the other guys as part of this series, they have found a way to sort of set me apart. They have labeled me as the older uncle of the group. And the fact is, I do have a nephew who is as old as some of them are. A few weeks ago, one of Pastor Mike's sons, he came up to me in the past reception area, and he said, "I like that shirt that you're wearing tonight." It was one of those plaid shirts. It's kind of popular to wear nowadays. And I said, well, I kind of felt odd wearing it because I had to go to the young men's section to buy it. You know what I'm talking about? The label of the section is young men anymore. And I didn't know. I get to the counter, and a beeper starts going off, an old man trying to buy a young man's shirt or something. But this is what Pastor Mike's, one of his sons, said. He said, "I like that shirt tonight. It makes you look young." Yeah, that's what I thought too. It makes you look young. That's not the worst part. When I told him that, I felt kind of awkward going in the young men's section. He said, "Don't worry about it. They probably thought you were shopping for your grandson or something." Yeah. All right. I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of bad boys or bad boys of the Bible. I'm sure that maybe for different persons it conjures up all sorts of different images as to what a bad boy even is. So in order to get us on a level playing field, I've sort of thought of a number of bad boys that have become popular over the years. And the first one that comes to mind for me is back in the 1950s, which predates this older uncle, by the way. Back in the 1950s, the original bad boy of Hollywood broke onto the big screen. His name is, I think we have a picture of him too, is James Dean. Now, doesn't he look like a bad boy? Now, James Dean, he once supposedly said this, that you live fast, you know what else he said? Die young and leave a good-looking corpse. And he did. At the age of 23, he died in a rather tragic car accident. That was the 1950s. If we jump to the 1970s, we sort of had a take on James Dean, but on the small screen, this time a guy by the name of, I think we have a picture of him too, by the name of the Fonz. Arthur Fonzarelli. He has that bad boy look, doesn't he? Except for this. Those who are of that generation, you have to know that when the Fonz tried to jump the shark wearing his leather jacket, he lost a lot of bad boy coolness points, at least for me. In the 1980s, we switched to a different arena. This time we switched to the tennis courts and found a bad boy there by the name of John McEnroe. And listen, if my hair looked like that, I would scream at a lot of people too. That was the 80s. In the 90s, we switched over to the basketball arena, and if this guy isn't a bad boy, I don't know who is. Dennis the Worm Rodman. Now, in the 2000s, we switched over to the football field with the antics of a guy who, some of his off-the-field antics has gotten him into trouble and got the bad boy name. His name is Big Ben. Big Ben Roethlisberger. And you Steelers fans, you're not going to listen to another word I have to say for the rest of the night, are you? Yeah, I didn't think so. I've already lost you. Today, most recently, we have a new bad boy on the scene. He's the highest paid actor on TV before he was fired, at least. The bad boy with tiger blood and Adonis DNA. You know what I'm talking about? None other than, I think we have a picture of him, don't we? There we go, Charlie Sheen, the biggest bad boy of them all today. But since having been here for a year or so on staff at Hope, I have found that Hope has had her fair share of bad boys over the years too. And I've done extensive research, and I've discovered that the two biggest bad boys on staff at Hope are these guys. Would you agree? So our two worship leaders, Carl and Chase, I've determined are the two biggest bad boys at Hope. Listen, I don't know what it is. I don't care who you are. If you're part of the band, I don't care if you're shaking a tambourine or if you're playing the ukulele, or heaven forbid, if you are playing the electric guitar. There's something about having a high bad boy quotient if you play in the band. Would you agree? There's something about being in the band that raises your bad boy quotient. Well, I have a question for you. What is it when it comes to bad boys that anyone has an appeal for at all? You've all heard it said that good girls, they go for bad boys, right? I'm not making that up, right? I don't know if we're supposed to talk about this in church or not, but we've all heard this said before. This is not the first time that you've heard this, that good girls go for the bad boys. There was actually some research reported on ABC News a few years ago. It was research that was called a European Journal of Personality, an academic journal. I sat around and reading this thing all the time. Yeah, the European Journal of Personality. But some academicians from places like University of Florida, University of Texas, they got together and they assessed what it meant to be a bad boy, and they published this stuff. And I guess your tax dollars probably funded it too. And they quantified what it means to be a bad boy and what it is regarding their appeal. And this is the way they summarize the research. They said, we think women would avoid these kinds of men. That was their presupposition going into the research. But they write, but what we found is counterintuitive, that women are, in fact, attracted to these bad boys. So I'm no longer just talking about social theory here. I'm talking about empirical reality, something that has some statistical significance, in fact, that good girls are apparently drawn to bad boys. And if you do not believe me, I'm just going to, close this section of the message with one word and one picture. Some of you will not recognize the word or the picture. I'm just going to prove my point. We'll go ahead and show the picture along with the one word. The one word is Bentley. Some of you have no clue what I'm talking about. Just ask the ladies when you leave tonight, and they will fill you in on this whole bad boy thing. You can't talk about it now, though. You got to listen to me, okay? All right. One of my favorite Christian authors is by the name of Shanti Feldhahn. We've got one of her books, in fact, in the bookstore. She writes these great books where she does all sorts of research to show men how the women think and how the men vice versa. And one of her most favorite books, at least for me, is called For Young Men Only. And she interviews a bunch of young ladies to ascertain what is going on in your minds. And then young men are supposed to read this book. And in one of the chapters in that particular book, she addresses this issue. She writes, many guys are puzzled why girls sometimes seem to go for the bad boy. What personality attributes might be attractive to you in a bad boy? Now, these are the personality distinctives that young ladies say that stand out to them in a positive way when it comes to bad boys. Things such as being confident, adventuresome, spontaneous, protective, a leader that other guys look up to, someone who's willing to break the mold, someone who's decisive. And what's interesting is when they ranked the attributes of bad boys, it was the negative attributes that they ranked at the bottom of the list, that they're really not drawn because of these things like foul language, an arrogant attitude, a smart mouth, being consumed with themselves, being narcissistic. So here's the ironic twist. What ladies are apparently telling us is that they actually like the good qualities in the bad boys, which is very important for us tonight because I'm going to be addressing a bad boy who has a lot of rather good qualities. You see, bad boys have always existed. They exist today, They existed in the 1950s with James Dean, and they existed all the way back in the original 50s, 50 AD, back in biblical times as well. And as part of this series, each one of the young guns and the older uncle is going to select one of the bad boys from the Bible and share a message about each one of those guys. Now, what I have done is this. I have selected the most notorious bad boy of them all when it comes to the Bible. The most notorious bad boy of them all. And as I've told people that, they have guessed all over the spectrum. One of the most commonly guessed persons is Samson. Others have guessed Satan. Others have guessed Judas. Others have guessed Saul of the Old Testament. Some have guessed Saul of the New Testament. And all of those are really good bad boys. That sounds strange. Really good bad boys of the Bible, except none of them is the most notorious bad boy of the Bible of all. And that's who we're going to focus on tonight. I'm going to give you some characteristics of this particular most notorious bad boy and see if you can figure him out before I just spell it out. First of all, this bad boy should have never even made a dent in history, considering that he just came from small town Nowheresville, Israel. When the bullies of his day tried to throw their weight around, this bad boy would do things like he would draw a line in the sand and practically dare them to cross it. This bad boy, he said things in a way that almost made it sound like his word was it. Like he was the ultimate authority. You know anyone like that in your life? I mean, they talk like they know it all. Well, this guy, when he spoke, it sounded like his word was the ultimate authority. His word was it. This ultimate bad boy of the Bible, he associated with what we might call the lowlifes. I don't like that term, but in Bible, they sort of use that term from time to time. He'd associate with the lowlifes in the Bible, and persons would actually go after him for that and tell him that if you keep on doing this, that their bad reputation is going to rub off on you. And what I love about this bad boy of the Bible, he could care less. He could care less. In fact, what's interesting about this bad boy is he didn't seem to be too concerned at all about being accepted by others, which is kind of interesting. In the sense that he sort of lived by this philosophy that if someone didn't accept him, or what he might say, that he lived by the philosophy, he'd just shake the dust off of his feet and find someone else who would listen to him. This bad boy, when everyone else would sort of back away from him and not stand for what he believed in, he would still believe in it, even if he was the only one. When it came to this bad boy, more than one time, groups of people tried to actually kill him, and one time they succeeded. You usually only have to succeed one time when you try to kill someone. What's amazing about this bad boy is even that couldn't keep him down. Research has shown that bad boys can actually have some rather good qualities. They can be decisive. They can be authoritative. They are willing to take risks, to take steps of faith, to break the mold. And that describes this notorious bad boy of the Bible pretty well. And it's not Samson, and it's not Satan, and it's not Judas, and it's not Saul of the Old or Saul of the New Testament. I don't know. Am I making this way too easy? I am. All right. In a day and age in which the Orthodox Jewish folks would not even utter the holy name of God out loud, along comes a man named Yeshua, which is what they would have called him in that day and age. In our day and age, we just call him Jesus. Along comes this bad boy of the Bible in a rather confident, decisive, authoritative, break the mold kind of way, and he has the nerve to say, "I am God." Good Jewish rabbis wouldn't even say the name of holy God out loud. Here comes along Yeshua saying, "I am." Now that's enough to get a good boy into trouble. And that's enough to get a bad boy killed. One of my favorite Christian authors is a guy by the name of Philip Yancey. I love what he writes because he has such a great Christian worldview. One of my favorite books of his is called The Jesus I Never Knew. And Yancey writes in the book that he got tired of just hearing others teach about Jesus, Sunday school teachers or preachers or college professors. He was learning all things secondhand about Jesus. He decided to jump into Scripture and to learn all sorts of things firsthand about Jesus. And in the book, he writes this. He said, "Jesus bore little resemblance to the Mr. Rogers figure I'd met in Sunday school. I love that statement. And was remarkably unlike the person I'd studied in Bible college. For one thing, he was far less tame. He says Jesus broke the mold. He goes on to say that they didn't crucify Jesus because they liked him so much. Sometimes when I teach about Jesus being crucified and I say these things, I can almost see it in people's eyes because it almost is an astounding thought to think that Jesus, when he was crucified, was the most hated man on earth. Yancey says they didn't crucify Jesus because they liked him so much. That sounds like a good point to me. They didn't crucify good guys. They didn't crucify persons who they liked. They didn't crucify persons who would bow down to Caesar. They didn't crucify persons who would play along with the Roman party line. They didn't crucify persons who would do what the religious authorities told them to do. They reserved crucifixion for the bad boys of the day, those who didn't fit the societal norms, those who would break the religious rules, those who were the revolutionaries of the day who just didn't fit. Those were the ones that they nailed to a tree. So let me clarify. Jesus was not a bad boy in the sense that he was disobedient to our Heavenly Father. But Jesus was a bad boy in the sense that he was revolutionary in the way that he approached man. And man didn't like that. There's so many instances of Scripture of Jesus doing just this, being the bad boy, of breaking societal norms, of breaking the religious rules. But tonight we just have time to focus on one in the book of John. In fact, it's John chapter 4. You probably know the most famous verse in all the Bible is in the chapter before that, in John chapter 3, John 3:16, in fact. If you know anything about John 3:16, I found a lot of people don't know who Jesus says John 3:16 to. It's actually to Nicodemus, who is a high-ranking Pharisee of the day. And if all you do is read John through to John chapter 3, you might think that Jesus just associated with those who are on the high end of the societal ladder, like Nicodemus was. But if you just go ahead and read John chapter 4, too, you'll also realize, Jesus did hang out with the Nicodemuses of his day, but he also hung out with someone in John chapter 4 as well who couldn't even reach the bottom rung of the societal ladder. And John chapter 4, verse 1 reads like this. It says the Pharisees, which is one of the religious ruling classes of the day, it says the Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John the Baptist. Now, I promise you, this is one of the verses in the Bible that 99 times out of 100, we read it and we sort of skip over it as quickly as we can to get to the good stuff. But I'm determined to believe that whenever God includes anything in His Word, that it's there for a reason, and it's all good stuff. And I like to sort of do some digging and play the CSI sort of game with Scripture. And I've determined that this verse is a beautiful verse that begins to lay the background for everything that's about to happen next in John chapter 4. The Pharisees, a religious ruling group, heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than even John the Baptist. Now, to put this in perspective, we've got to know that John the Baptist was a bit of a crazy-looking guy, right? He dressed in crazy-looking ways. He spoke, crazy-sounding things. And people were drawn to this guy named John the Baptist, and he was on their radar screen. Any guy who would stand up and look like that and talk a message like John was talking, he was on their radar screen. And so when we read that Jesus was drawing a bigger crowd than John, suddenly guess who had just become public enemy number 1? Jesus bumped John down to number 2. And Jesus became the number 1 person of interest. Pay attention to this verse here. It says that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. It doesn't just say that Jesus was drawing a crowd, but rather he was gaining disciples and baptizing them, meaning that he was gaining followers who were buying into what he had to say. And if you're a part of the religious ruling class or the political ruling class of that was bad news. It was one thing for someone to be drawing a crowd and to listen to a renegade guy, but for folks to come out and to buy into what he's saying and to be declared his disciple, that was bad news for a bad boy. That was bad news. And so in John chapter 4, verse 3, we read this. When Jesus learned of this, he did something. He left Judea, which is where the Pharisees' home base of Jerusalem was located, and he went back once more to Galilee. It almost sounds like Jesus was running scared at this point. He was not running scared. Rather, it just wasn't his time to be captured and crucified. Not yet. Now, we need to know that Jesus would oftentimes go down to the southern part of Israel, known as Judea, where Jerusalem was located. And in fact, what we need to do tonight to really make this begin to make sense, to understand why that Jesus would go from the southern part of Israel to the northern part, let's just do a quick, on a hot summer's night in July, the most favorite thing you could ever imagine is to do a geography lesson on Israel, right? Well, let's do that just real quickly. It is real easy to do because Israel is about the size of one of our small states here in America. And Israel in Jesus' day really is, it only had like 3 provinces. This is real easy, okay, so we won't get lost on this. But the southern part of Israel is known as Judea. That's where Jerusalem was at, and so where all the religious activity was really taking place. And when this chapter starts, that's where Jesus was at. But we're told that when he realizes that they're sort of on his heels, and so he's going to go to Galilee. Well, Galilee is the region to the north. So we have the region of Judea to the south, the region of Galilee to the north, and I said that there were 3 sections. Well, there's a middle section. That is the region of Samaria. And we need to take note of that because what's going to happen here is Jesus is going to go from the southern region of Judea to the northern region of Galilee, but there's a place in the middle called Samaria. Now, if you're a good guy in Jesus' day, or if you were a good Jewish rabbi in Jesus' day, if you were going to go from the southern region to the northern region, one place you would not go is the middle, not through Samaria. We don't have to have an advanced lesson in geometry to know that the shortest distance between 2 points is what? It's a straight line. At the risk of revealing my small-town Kentucky background, it's as the crow flies, right? Does that make sense? Anybody else who grew up in a small town somewhere? All right. It's a straight line. That's the shortest distance between 2 points, unless there's a problem in the middle or a person or an impediment in the middle that you don't want to encounter. In fact, if you're a good Jewish guy, a good Jewish rabbi in Jesus' day, the problem in the middle, this region known as Samaria, was so intense, they created a bypass around Samaria. We do this today, right? Even though the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, when it comes to big cities, we don't want to drive in the middle of a big city during rush hour. We will build bypasses around those cities so we won't have to get clogged up in traffic, right? They did that in Jesus' day too. They would cross over, the bypass would take them to the right over the eastern border of Israel, which is the Jordan River. They would travel north, cross, then over west over the Jordan River to get back to the northern section if they were doing that, which means they would take 2 to 3 extra days to go from southern Israel to northern Israel to avoid what was in the middle. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what was actually in the middle that they were so intent about avoiding. In the middle was this region known as Samaria. And hundreds of years before the time of Christ, Israel had been invaded by a nation known as Assyria. And those who lived in the middle of the country, they had assimilated and even intermarried with the invaders into their land. And the ardent, good guy Jewish population, they began to detest them. Even though they were really kin to them, they all had the same great-great-great-great-grandma and grandpas. They were all kin to them, but they sort of disowned them because they now detested them, because they considered them to be sellouts, to be infidels. They called them all sorts of derogatory names, like half-breeds. In fact, if you were a Samaritan and were to try to go down to Jerusalem and worship in the temple, they wouldn't let you in. Even you had Jewish background, they would not let you in. They would make you stay outside the temple court along with the Gentiles, along with all the other non-Jewish persons. They absolutely detested the idea of even hanging around a Samaritan. And yet we go down to verse 4 in our text, and we read this about Jesus. As he's trying to, in essence, get away from those who are heavy on his heels, going from the south to the north, he could have done just like any other good Jewish guy, any good Jewish rabbi would have done, taken the bypass. That's what a good guy would have done. But verse 4 says this. It said Jesus, or he, had to go through Samaria. Now, it doesn't mean that he had to go through it because geographically he had to go there, but Jesus had to go through Samaria because he wasn't willing to avoid those that all the good Jewish guys were willing to avoid. Bad boys will do that. Bad boys will do things that no one else is willing to do, even if they're standing on their own. They are bold, they are decisive, they are authoritative, and they don't need someone else to stand by them to take a different path. One of my favorite poems of all time is written by Robert Frost. It's way back in the 1916, which is before me as well, but 1916, called The Road Not Taken, and it goes like this. It says, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. You've heard that before, right? 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Yogi Berra, that great theologian that he was and is, he once said that if you ever come to a fork in the road, take it. Yeah. I wish life were that easy, but it's not that easy, is it? You know, in real life, when you come to a fork in the road, we face hard decisions all the time. And can I tell you that the easiest thing for me and you to do is to take the bypass around difficult people and difficult places? In fact, can I sort of just guess here that a lot of people here have Samaritans in your life? Persons who sort of stand in the middle of where you're at and where you want to go. And you'll do anything you can to avoid them, even build a bypass around them. Some of you at work, there's a lady down the hall who gets on your nerves. Honestly, you cannot pass her in the hallway without her saying something that just makes you want to run and scream. The problem is the restroom is 2 doors down from her room. It is. So you know what you do? You'll actually get on the elevator and go to 2 floors below to go to the restroom there to avoid the Samaritan down the road. You will do that. Some of our teenagers, what they will do is they'll take some very strange routes to get from one classroom to the other. I mean, routes that don't make sense unless you realize that what they're really doing is they're avoiding that guy who broke up with them last week, or they're avoiding that girl who always makes fun of them. We all know what it means to have Samaritans in our lives, don't we? Problems, impediments, people that we'd rather not relate to. And we're very good at building bypasses around those people, and yet we read in John 4, verse 4, that Jesus took not the bypass, but the road that was less traveled. In verse 6, we're told this, that Jesus traveled for a distance into Samaria. And just like any guy would, he got tired eventually, and he sat down at a well. He was thirsty, he was hungry, he was tired, he was by himself. And it shouldn't surprise us that in the middle of the day, in fact, it was right about noon. I'm sure it was very hot and very humid on this day at noon in Israel. No one else was at the well. It shouldn't surprise us that no one else was at the well in the middle of the day, because the wells were located outside the city walls. It was designed that way on purpose. And women and children were given the task of going to get the water from the well. And they usually would go during the morning and of the evening when it was cooler. And Jesus arrived in the middle of the day. He arrived when no one was there. But something happens in verse 7. We're told that when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, there's a lot going on here. In the middle of the day, they're not supposed to be out there drawing water, but along comes a Samaritan woman. Hope you see some things that I'm seeing here. You see, to the good guy Jew, for a Samaritan to come along, what that meant was that this person was spiritually unclean. Not that they were like physically dirty, but spiritually unclean. If you got too close to them, sort of it would rub off on you. And if you were then to try to go back to the temple to worship, you'd have to go through a several-day period, even a several-week period of spiritual purification just to worship God again, just by coming in contact with one of these unclean Samaritans. In verse 27, we read this. His disciples finally catch up with Jesus. They returned, and we read that they were surprised to find him talking to a woman. The word that we translate in the NIV, surprised, is actually one of my favorite words in the Greek. It's the Greek word thaumazo. I just like the way it sounds, thaumazo, but I also like the intensity of its meaning, and I don't think in the NIV that we bring it out well enough. The Greek word thaumazo, which is the expression that his disciples had when they saw him talking to this woman, actually means to be amazed. It means to be astonished. It means to be struck with a sense of wonder. The disciples catch up with Jesus, and by the way, they must have loved it to know that their good Jewish rabbi was taking the straight path through Samaria. That must have really sat well with them. And then they catch up with him and find him talking with the woman, and they are thaumazoed. It's as if it was one of the great wonders of the world that their good Jewish rabbi was messing things up once again. In verse 9, we read this. The Samaritan woman said to Jesus, "You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And Scripture inserts, "For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." She knew the rules, and she didn't understand what this guy was doing. We go on in this passage to learn that not only is this person a Samaritan, not only is she a woman, but Jesus reveals to her that he knows much more about her. He reveals that he knows that she has been divorced 5 times. And he goes on to say that the man you're now living with is not even your husband. That is really important for us to take note of. In that day and age, a man could divorce a woman for virtually anything. A woman couldn't do that. She didn't have the legal right to do that. In reverse, a man could put his wife out on the street, and since the woman had very little earning potential and very little education, what that would mean, unless her biological family would take her back in, that meant that woman would be relegated to begging or prostituting on the street. 5 times this had happened to this woman. And now he says, the man you're living with is not even your husband. Now she's doing whatever she has to do just to have a roof over her head, to keep from begging and prostituting on the street. This explains why when Jesus arrives at the well, that this woman comes along in the middle of the day. Because she's used to going there by herself. She's used to going there when no one else is around. Because this is amazing. In the middle of all the outcasts in Samaria, in the middle of all these outcasts, she is an outcast. It's one thing to not be liked by other people. It's another thing not to be liked by the people who are not even liked by the other people. She is an outcast of the outcasts. What's amazing to me is this is right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is just John chapter 4. It was just 2 chapters earlier that he did his first miracle, the whole wine into water thing. And yet one of the first persons that he reveals his true identity, his messiahship to, is a woman that no one else will even speak to. Verses 25 and 26 say, the woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming, and when he comes, he'll explain everything to us." And then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you," who is that you? A Samaritan woman, divorced 5 times, now living with a man. "I who speak to you am he." I don't know if this gets to you or not, but it sort of gets to me to think that one of the first persons Jesus reveals his identity to, his messiahship, is someone that no one else will even speak to. You know, we are so fortunate to serve, to be a part of a church like Hope. One of the things that drew me here to serve, I moved here from Atlanta. I'd pastored a church there for 5 years. And an awesome thing when God opened the church here, door here for me to serve. And I get here and I realize what a privilege it is to be a part of a church that is right now, for instance, in the middle of housing a series of homeless families. We've been doing that for 2 weeks in the rooms upstairs. What church does that sort of thing? I get to know people like Byron McMillan and now James Johnson on staff serving with local Hope, who are determined to take us out into parts of our community that no one else wants to go through. They would rather build a bypass around them. I love being part of a church like Hope. The church I had the chance to pastor back in Atlanta, we were determined to get our people out of the walls of the building and to be the body of Christ in the community. And so we did. We began to invest in our local schools and find kids who would go to school with tattered shoes on their feet and give them supplies, just providing practical means of ministering in our community. And we did, all sorts of things of finding ways to minister to local college students and all sorts of things of finding developmentally disabled opportunities to serve in our community. But one of the things that was most meaningful to me is we began to reach out to kids that we could find who were orphaned or didn't have moms or dads for whatever reason. We plugged into a network of Christian-based children's homes, and we found a way to potentially serve. We found that one of the closest part of this network of children's homes was about 2 hours away from where we were in Atlanta, in Palmetto, Georgia. We made a trip there, took a bunch of supplies, and it was the neatest thing. Several acres laid out with all these cottages, and all these kids, like 8 to 10 in a cottage with these house parents, and that was their family, because they didn't have biological families anymore, because they were orphaned or because of abuse, whatever it is. This was their this was their home. And it was a Christian-based network. It was absolutely awesome to see. The problem was it was just too far away from us to be invested on a daily, personal sort of way. We asked them, is there any place you know that's closer to us? And they said, well, there is a place that is closer to where you're at in North Atlanta. The problem is no church no church wants to go there. Man, I don't know about you, but when someone tells me no church wants to go there, that's where I want to go. What it was is they told us this is a facility that's part of the same network that deals with a treatment center for teenagers who are dealing with drug and alcohol addictions. And they said, look around, all these little kids around here, bunches of churches are willing to help us out. How could you not? They're adorable. But no one wants to help them out. Went back home. I began to ask around. No one even knew this place existed. It was 5 miles down the street. And I started getting families in our church interested. At first, they sort of fought me because it was like, we don't want them to rub off on us. I said, okay, I got a bunch of our senior citizens who'd been through some wars and had raised some prodigal children, and it was the senior citizens and the older uncle. We made our way down to the treatment center for the teenagers who were dealing with alcohol and drug rehab. And we just took them supplies. We found a bunch of these kids were just dropped off there with nothing but the clothes in their backs. They didn't have the basic rudimentary things that they would need. They had an accredited school on campus, all this good stuff. But these kids would have nothing. And so we began to sort of try to meet their needs, just be there for them. And we began to sort of just hang out with them. And, we found their washing machine. I'm really from a small town in Kentucky, aren't I? Their washing machine had broken down, so we bought them one because no church was there for them. We began just to invest in them, have silly game nights and basketball times, just to hang out with them. And an interesting thing happened over time. As we began to invest in these kids and the rest of the church sort of got on board with us, we found these kids would open up their hearts to us. What's amazing is this. We saw one, not all of them, but one after another of these kids come to Christ. Just because they're in a Christian treatment center didn't mean that they knew Christ. We saw one after another come to Christ. What was music to my ears one day was this, because they would take them to churches in the community. What was music to my ears one day is when one of the leaders called me up and said, our kids are asking if we'll take them to your church. Wow. I've been doing this now for 18 years. And that is music to my ears. To your kids, teenagers, in a treatment center for drug and alcohol rehab to say, will you please take us to their church? And the reason they gave is this. They said they treat us like people. They would take them to other churches, and as soon as they found out who they were, they would segment them. They wouldn't even let them go to classes where other kids were in because they didn't want them to rub off. And they said they treat us like people. I got an email from one of the teachers on the campus there one time. He said this, I've seen a great deal of spiritual growth and maturity among our students in a short period of time. I know that many people are working with them, but most of them credit your church for these changes. I hear unbelievable testimonies and praise reports and recaps each Monday of what they learned at your church on Sunday. I wanted to personally thank you for all the work that you've done with them. On an unrelated note, this guy wrote, if you ever decide to move to another church and they need a youth pastor, my wife and I would be happy to help out even if it's out of state. That was huge for me to read, even though I didn't really even know the guy, because what he was saying was this, I would love to go to a place that is taking the road that is less traveled. I want to be a part of something that is making a difference. And isn't that the cry of all of our hearts? None of us wants to go to the grave thinking, I wasted my life, I impacted no one. One of the kids left us a note one day and he said this, I have a praise report that I got on my knees and asked for forgiveness for the first time. I feel like your church played a big role on my relationship with God. I was atheist my whole life. Remember, when I was a teenager, I was atheist my whole life. And by the grace of God, I'm now getting closer and closer every day. Your church has shown me so much affection. You know what happened when this lady had this encounter with Jesus and she went back into town? Verse 39 tells us, it says, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. Hey, listen, up to this point, they would see the woman coming and they would run. They didn't want to hear anything she had to say. Now I'm figuring she is chasing them down, and they have to listen to what she has encountered. And we read that many outcasts believe because of the changed life of an outcast amongst the outcasts. Hey, listen, I want to wrap up today by encouraging, challenging you just in a couple of ways. If you're here tonight and you're that person, you are that person at the well. You know what it means to carry a stigma. You know what it means for a person to build a bypass around your life. You know what it means to even come into a church and maybe sit alone just because. Listen, if you're that person, can I just assure you and remind you tonight that Jesus will go out of his way to meet you right where you are. And maybe no one else will do this for you, but he will show you have value, you have worth, you have significance. And this life that you're about to give up on, he will show you that he can give you new life. I also want to challenge you, if you're part of this church, you're part of Hope. No one perhaps has ever challenged you like this before. I want to challenge you to be a bad boy. Will you be one of Hope's bad boys with us? This thing that we say, be a change, or be the change, it's not just a slogan here at Hope. Will you really be a bad boy who will go through the middle of the mess to reach the people that everyone else builds a bypass around? Be the change. Be a bad boy. Go the road that is less traveled. Because according to Robert Frost, that is the path that ends up making all the difference. It's not by taking the easy road. It's not by taking the bypass. It's by taking the road that is less traveled. Let me pray for you before we go. Heavenly Father, my heart especially goes out to anyone who might have walked in here tonight and they walked in here, Lord, thinking that I am unloved and I'm unlovable, and this burden that I'm carrying around, Lord, no one will ever value me because of that. Lord, I pray that they will hear tonight and just know that because of what Jesus Christ has done for them and the way that he cares for them, they can leave here tonight a very different, a very changed person. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Hey, listen, we'd love to meet with you in the pastor reception area across from the coffee shop. If you want to talk, that'd be great. If you're new, we'd especially love to spend time with you. Thank you for putting up with me tonight. Have a great evening.